All right, so we should be live now. This is my first time streaming, so I'm just gonna have to wait to see if it works. It all appears to be working. I'm just gonna mute the audio. Cool. All right, welcome. So today we're going to be creating a Terraform module to set up OIDC authentication with Hashicorp Boundary. So this is my first time using the Auth0 provider. I've done a teeny tiny bit of pre-read in the last 10 minutes, but I'm going to be diving into this head first, having not looked at the provider at all before. So it should be fun. Let's get started. So I've created a Git repo, which is on my GitHub, and it's public. So everybody can go and actually see the code. And once we've finished and we've got it working, oops, not that one, I will be publishing it to the Terraform registry, as well as creating an Auth0 module. The plan is, as you might have just seen, for me to create one for Azure, Okta, and Google as well. So we've got 4 modules that set up OIDC with probably the 4 biggest providers. But Boundary can be configured to use OIDC from any provider that does support OpenID Connect. So that it's not limited to just these 4 by any means. It's just these are just the 4 that I'm going to focus on. And this module will be used in the course that I'm currently writing, which is the Complete Guide to Boundary, which is debuting on the 27th of November. Everything we do today will be used at a later date as well. Right, so to configure OIDC in Boundary, you have to create a application in Auth0. So this is one I've done earlier to test whether I could get OIDC working, which I did. But I manually created all this, click ops through the console. So the idea is now that I want to codify this into a Terraform module that can connect to Auth0, create the required application, and then also connect to Boundary and create the required resources within Boundary to set up the connection with Auth0 for OIDC. So that's what we're going to try and do today. We might not get it all finished, but we might get most of it done. Who knows? So I, like I said, don't know anything about the Auth0 provider. So we're just going to dive in. I'm going to guess from this example here, which is in the quick start section, that client is the resource we're going to have to use. So application acceptance tests. Yeah, it looks like this represents what an application is in here. Because there's not an actual application resource that I can see. So I assume this is what it is, which is a bit confusing, but we'll go with that. Okay, so in VS Code, I've just got a README that come with the repo when I created it. So we're going to create the initial structure. So we're going to have a main.tf. We're going to have a outputs.tf. We're going to have a variables.tf. And then we're going to have a terraform.tf. And we'll start with terraform.tf first. So we're going to define our Terraform block. And we're going to put our required providers in. Rather than typing that out, we can just go to the registry, use provider, and we can get the required providers block from here. I always like, some people don't do this in their Terraform modules. I prefer doing it because then there's no confusion as to whether the module will work with a specific provider version. And it gives me the ability to, if I want to, lock this version so that it can only be used with it, or make sure that what I tend to do is just put greater than or equal to, so that it has to be a minimum of this version, but we can assume that it will work with any other version that's 0.x. So we're only going to create the Auth0 provider at the moment. Eventually, we'll probably have the boundary provider in here as well, but this is all we really need in this file for the time being. This is a Terraform module, so we're not going to configure any type of state. We'll do that in a separate, when we actually come to test the module and we actually consume it, we will configure state in that repository. And for state, I'll be using Terraform Cloud to manage that. Name is the only required variable or parameter. Sorry. So we're going to define this in main, and again, to save me having to type everything, we're going to do what every good senior engineer does and use copy pasta. So we're going to define name, and we're going to define that as var.name. And then we're going to also define a variable. And we're going to do that as value. We're not going to specify a value because we want it to be required. So we can put required equals true. Put description. And we can also put that to in 0. Okay. So we've got the start of something. I need to change my tabs to spaces because it really annoys me, but I'm not going to do that right now. You can also add a description as well, which we will give the option to do that as well. And we'll sort out all the formatting after as well. We won't do that straight away. So we're going to provide a description and then app type. So let's look at what the values are for that. So app type of the application the client represents. Possible values are native SPA, regular app, non-interactive SSO, specific SSO. Types are accepted as well. Okay. Cool. So app type. We're not going to provide a variable for this because we're specifically configuring OIDC for Boundary. We already know what that type's going to be. Hashicorp have got a great tutorial on OIDC authentication with Boundary, and it covers a few of the providers. It covers Azure, Auth0, Okta, and Azure AD. So we can see if we scroll down, they create an application, and it's just a regular web application. So we just need to find the corresponding app type here, which I guess will just be regular web. So we can take that and we can pass that in. And I've been using a Windows computer too much because I keep pressing Control C rather than Command C, as you can see, 3 times. There we go. Okay. So let's go back to the client. So what else do they define? Custom login page. We don't need that. We don't need these. So let's just go back to the documentation and have a look. So they configure a regular web application, and then they create a callback URL, which is, okay, so we're going to have to, so as well, I'm also creating this for, well, I guess it'll be, you can use this for HCP or dev mode. So you can like stand up Boundary using Boundary-dev, I think it is. And that'll stand up a local instance of Boundary on your computer. You should be able to use this module to configure that as well. But what we're going to need to do is create a variable input to get the URL. This callback URL is the same. This kind of this path here, so we can take that eventually and just hard code that in, because that won't change, and that will be something that's updated by the module, not the user. But we do want to create a variable that will take a URL. So we've got another variable to create as well. So we'll just come down and create that. So we want description. We will specify default on this, which will be the boundary OIDC connection application. No, that doesn't make sense. Description for the application in auth 0. And we won't put that, we'll put that as the description for this, and then we'll put the default. So it's not required by the user as boundary OIDC. And then we're going to want to define a variable of boundary URL. So description your boundary instance URL defaults to localhost, and then we're going to have a default which we're going to set to localhost, which we'll just grab from the documentation. So as you can see, the boundary by default launches on 1200, and I didn't copy that right. Cool. And I'm just going to run terraform fmt to format things, and we got an error. Dev. Cool. Okay. So we've got our boundary URL, we've got our description, we've got our name, and so far we've got our name, description, and app type set. So now we need to actually set the callback URL. So we need to find out what that is in boundary, because it's an in the UI it's called an allowed callback URL. So hopefully in the provider we'll just have a allowed, I'm guessing it's going to be callbacks. So if we take that and then just go and check the docs. So callbacks is a list of string URLs that auth 0 may call back to after user authenticates to for the client. Okay, yeah, that looks like what we're after. So we're going to specify callback URLs, and we're also going to take the fixed part of the URL, and we're going to specify that in there, and then we're going to interpolate the variable we just created, which is boundary URLs, boundary URL even. And on the end of this, we're just going to put do not include a end of input. The reason I'm specifying that is I ran into an issue earlier on last week where I was configuring boundary, but I was specifying like a fully qualified URL with a slash on the end. So my actual URL started looking like that. I was getting some weird behavior and the error wasn't really clear. So we're just going to be explicit in the documentation that they shouldn't be including a slash on the end of their URL, because we're going to do that for them. Okay. And as far as that goes, we shouldn't actually have that much more to do. So there's also the allowed logout URLs, which is just or it is not, I'm not assuming that is the homepage for your Boundary instance with a :3000. Whether the :3000 applies to dev mode as well, I don't know. Yes, it does. Cool. So there should also be within the client documentation something for logout, allowed logout URLs, which is again a list of strings. So we're going to take that, we're going to specify it. We're going to pass in a list of string, which will be, again, we're going to interpolate the boundary URL that's provided to us by the user. And then on the end of that, we're going to interpolate the port. Cool. Again, we're going to terraform F&T just to automatically format everything. So we've got the name, the description, the app type, which is fixed. We've got our callback URL, which has been defined as a variable for the changing part, and then the fixed path on the end. And then we've got our allowed logout URLs. So that is great. And that should be about it for the actual configuration of the application within inside of Auth0. There are a few things that you need. So 3 important values listed at the top of settings for using when configuring OIDC with Boundary: domain, client ID, and client secret. So if we're going to configure Boundary within this module, then we can just pass those around. So we can just pull the resource. Hopefully the client has there's a nested schemas. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to just pull those from the client, which it doesn't look like we can. Interesting. Now I'm questioning whether that's actually the right resource, which would be fun. But let's try it. Let's give it a whirl. So that's saved. I'm going to come out of that directory, and I'm going to create in fact, I'm going to go back into the Auth0 provider directory. I'm just going to make a directory called test. I'm going to cd into test. And we're going to do a search to create terraform.tf. So inside of here, we've got this. So we're going to specify our Terraform block. And we're going to just take our required provider from there as well. And again, too much windows. So we're specifying the provider that we're going to use, and I'm just going to call this all in one file. So I'm going to call the module Auth0 Boundary OIDC. I'm going to specify our source as the directory just up from us. And then we've got a few things in spaces. So we're just going to call this Boundary OIDC module. Description, we're not going to do anything. And then we're going to specify boundary URL, which I have a boundary instance on HCP running. So I'm going to log in and get that URL for us now. I'm going to authenticate using GitHub. Go to Boundary, and I'm just going to turn off my screen while I get some credentials. And the portal isn't loading, which is great. So I don't mind sharing that because I can delete the instance after. So we're specifying our boundary URL. We've not got a slash on the end of the URL, so that's good. And what else have we got? Those are the only 3 inputs we've got at the moment. So if we just close off that and the README, the outputs. So I'm just going to do a terraform. I actually need to specify the provider, which would actually help. So I'll specify the Auth0 provider. We're also going to need this stuff. So I'm just going to move that file up into that directory. So we're going to need to configure a way to authenticate to Auth0 to create this. So let's have a look at the documentation. For Terraform to be able to access resources in Auth0, we need to create an Auth0 machine-to-machine type application that allows Terraform to communicate with Auth0. Wicked. So we're going to go into Auth0. You can sign up for a free account, by the way. So if you do want to run any of this against Auth0 itself, you definitely can do that, and it is free. I'm not paying for anything. You do get put onto a trial straight away, but that's fine. So we're going to create a machine-to-machine application. We're going to call it Terraform Auth0. And I'm just going to change my screen while I create. In fact, I don't need to do that yet because I've selected the Auth0 management API as the API that we want to use. And then let's just double check what permissions we need to give it. So, okay, so we just want to click all, which is nice and easy. And then we're going to click authorize. Again, I'm just changing my screen in case there are any secrets. As I'm doing this live, I don't want to leak any credentials to my Auth0 account. Brilliant. So yeah, that's created, and now you can go to the settings tab. Again, I'll just show you on this documentation page, and then we can get the required credentials for the provider, which are domain, client ID, and client secret. I'm using Derenv to configure all of my credentials, so I can just export. I can copy this and put it into into an mvarc file. If you not use Derenv, I definitely recommend looking into it. It allows you to export environment variables when you CD in and out of directories. It's really useful when you're working between different projects. So I'm going to go ahead and copy over the credentials out of my Auth0 machine-to-machine application. In fact, I can just show you, the secret is hidden, so I can show you what it looks like. So we've got the machine-to-machine application created, Terraform Auth0. We've got my domain, which is withasoft.eu.auth0.com. We've got the client ID, and then we've got the client secret. So we're going to copy this. Again, I'm just going to hide my screen because secrets. It would not be a good start to my day if I was to go out and leak secrets. Hey, Alistair. So we've set that. So inside of my test directory, and I'll just leak my secret. Great. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just quickly delete the application and recreate it. Oh, dear me. So I'll just show myself recreating that application again. So it's terraform auth0. We want it to be the machine type, the management API, and then we want all of the permissions, and we want to click authorize. We then want to go to settings. I'm going to need to update the client ID, which again, I'm just going to not reveal all of the secrets this time because that seems to be easier. And we're done. Okay. Okay, so now I've got those variables defined inside of the mvarc file. So I can just run dir env allow, and that will load those 3 variables into my shell. So we've got auth0 domain, auth0 client secret, and auth0 client ID. If we go back to the quick start documentation, it says, so we can just specify a blank auth0 provider, and as long as we've got these 3 variables set into our shell, we can just run terraform. So let's give that a go. So let's just run a terraform init, and and it would help if I spell module right. Okay, required true. Required is not an argument expected here. Okay, I didn't think. Let's get rid of that. Cool. So we've successfully initted Terraform. We've got a .terraform folder that's appeared in our test directory. And then we've got our modules and providers and stuff. So now we can do a Terraform plan. And hopefully we should see some stuff come up. Yeah, wicked. So we've got the module, which is just called my client. At the moment, we need to change that. It's a regular web application, and we've got the full callback URL, which has been defined correctly. So we can do a Terraform apply. Yes. Cool. So that's created. So we can go back into auth0 now, and hopefully inside of applications, we should see Boundary OIDC module. Nice. So if we open that up, again, we've got our description that we're populating. We've got the name that we're populating. It's a regular web application, which is the type we wanted. And we've got our allowed callback URL in the correct box, and we've got our logout URL in the correct box. So that's great. And that is all we need to do to configure the auth0 side. So that is, in terms of auth0 configuration, that is for the actual application and connecting to Boundary, that's it. You are required to have users in auth0, obviously. So I do have a username and password authenticated user, which is just my email. So we can now look at starting to connect this into Boundary. So how do we do that? Well, first off, we can just close that directory for the time being. And we can, I'm just going to put this as client, just to be explicit that it's the auth0 client that we're creating. And we're now going to look at the provider documentation for Boundary. So if we go to the registry, we can find the Boundary documentation, and it is an official provider as well. So first off, we're going to take our required providers block, and we're going to specify that in our terraform.tf. We don't need everything that I just copied because we've already got that. So we're just adding a second provider that's required. And then we can go to the documentation and open up resources. So the thing that we need to configure is the boundary auth method OIDC. So this is what creates the actual OIDC connection within Boundary. So if I go to my Boundary instance, and I need to get the URL for it. So I can go to my Boundary admin page, and at the moment, we can see that I've only got a password authentication method set. So I can sign in with that, and then I'm into the Boundary UI. And then if I go down to auth methods, again, we can see that we've only got the password auth method created, and we want to create a new one of those. We want to create an OIDC method so that we can connect to Auth0. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to do that with Terraform. So again, the Hashicorp documentation is great. So if we go all the way down here to auth method creation, click Terraform, this is the resource we need to create. Okay. So we're just going to copy pasta from the Hashicorp docs, and we're going to specify our auth method. So what do we want to call it? We want to call it auth0. I'm not going to change that. I'm going to leave that as a fixed variable. And I'm also going to do that for description as well, because these are going to be, we know that this is always going to be auth0, and we know it's the OIDC connection to auth0 because that's the type of module that we're creating. Scope ID, these are the things that we need to update. So hopefully we will be able to pull some stuff from the Auth0 client and the Auth0 Terraform provider. So open up the Auth0 Terraform provider again. I'm going to go to documentation. I'm going to have a look in data sources. Wicked. So we're going to add this tenant data source. And I'm going to put my data sources at the top. What does that allow us to do? That allows us to get the Auth0 issuer URL, which is just your Auth0 domain. So we can do data.auth0 tenant dot. I'm just going to call this tenant for ease of use. My tenant dot domain. So domain, you can see, is a string, and that returns your Auth0 domain. That's brilliant. So next, we're going to need to get the client ID and the secret ID. I'm just going to get rid of these comments off the end, because we know what those are. And then we've got boundary address. So this API URL prefix, that's easy. That is specifying the boundary address. So we can go ahead and interpolate the variable that we created earlier. So it's var.boundary URL. The sign-in algorithm we're going to leave as RS256. And now we need to get our scope ID, our client ID, and our client secret. So the Auth0 client, hopefully, I noticed there is a data source. I was hoping we could just get that off the actual resource itself rather than having to use the data source. So optional, read owner, yes, cool. So we can get the client ID, the client secret, and the signing keys. Brilliant. So we can do auth0 client dot client dot client ID, and then we can do the same for the client secret. So client secret. Brilliant. The only other thing we need to pass in is the boundary scope ID. So I'm going to create a variable for that. I'm going to create a variable for that in here, not in the actual middle of a resource, which will be boundary scope ID. And we're going to add a description for that, which is going to be the global boundary scope ID. And we're not going to set default for that because we want that to be passed in. Very quickly, I'm going to cd out of this into my module. I'm going to run a terraform fmt to make sure everything's correct. So we've got an invalid expression. Main.tf line 14 is just that because it's empty. So we can just do var boundary scope ID. Run a terraform fmt, everything's correct. Okay, brilliant. So we've now got boundary configured as well. So that should be about everything. There are a few other things that you have to do as well, which include provisioning the user for OIDC initially. So we won't do that as part of the module, but we will do that in the code that we're going to use to test whether it's working. So I will just pop that in there ready for us later, and we'll come back to that. First off, I'm going to create some documentation for what we've done so far. The best way to that is with Terraform docs. It's a fantastic project. I use it in every client that I work with. So we're going to brew install that. I don't think I've got a version of that locally. Cool. And then you can do Terraform docs, markdown, and then I just want to output it in my terminal. So we can take all of this. We can go into our README and we can paste it in. I realize that is a bit big. If I just zoom out a tiny bit. So we've got no outputs. It's got all of our inputs. We've got the name, description, type, default, and required. The resources that we've used, I prefer putting the resources right at the bottom, just because I don't think they're... when I read documentation for a module, I prefer getting straight to the inputs and outputs because that is most likely what I'm looking for. I do like being able to see which resources are being used within a module, but I just put Terraform module to configure OIDC within Hashicorp Boundary using auth0. Okay. So we can clear that out and we can git status. And I'm going to add main Terraform variables and readme. I'm not adding the outputs because we don't actually have any outputs at the moment. So there's no point in specifying a blank file. So I'm just going to put a commit in. And I am committing directly to main. You have seen that correctly. I'm the only person working on this so far, so I'm not concerned about branching off, creating pull requests. However, when this does go to, well, it is public right now, as I've just pushed the repo. I will be making sure that we follow like a proper branching strategy if anybody does want to contribute to it. So there we go. We've got the code up on GitHub. Really simple module so far. There's not really much to actually creating the OIDC connection with Boundary. It's really simple. And yeah, so that's a good place to be. We've been going for almost 50 minutes now. So I'm going to call this to a halt here. And then in the next episode, which will be tomorrow, I'll do a live stream tomorrow evening. We're going to finish off creating the connection and testing it with Boundary. Yeah. So thank you very much for tuning in. I appreciate it. If you have found this useful, please remember to subscribe and drop a like and a comment down below. And go and give the module a star on GitHub. And if anybody wants to change anything, if you think that things can be made better, please do open a pull request, and we can get those merged in. Right. Thank you very much.